Wednesday, March 5th, 2026, and the world's most powerful aircraft carriers are facing an enemy they cannot defeat. USS Gerald R. Ford and USS Abraham Lincoln combined represent $13 billion in construction costs alone. Together, they carry nearly 200 combat aircraft capable of striking targets thousands of miles away. But despite this overwhelming firepower, both carriers are operating hundreds of miles from Iranian shores. The reason is not Iranian air defenses or submarines or even their conventional navy. The threat keeping $13 billion warships at safe distance comes from missiles that launch in minutes. Iran's rapid launch anti-ship ballistic missiles, nicknamed Squirters by some naval analysts, are changing naval warfare forever. And they are proving that even America's most advanced weapons platforms have fundamental vulnerabilities that money cannot solve. This is why U.S. carriers are retreating, and what Iran's Squirter missiles reveal about the future of naval power. The term Squirter refers to the characteristic that makes Iranian anti-ship missiles so dangerous their rapid launch capability. Unlike liquid-fueled missiles that require hours of preparation, solid fuel systems can fire within 15 to 30 minutes. Mobile launchers, positioned along Iran's 1,500-kilometer coastline, can receive targeting data and launch almost immediately. By the time American satellites detect the launch preparations and relay warnings to carrier strike groups, missiles are already airborne. This compressed timeline eliminates the advantage that American reconnaissance and precision strike capabilities normally provide. Traditional counter-battery operations depend on detecting launch preparations and destroying systems before they fire, but Squirter missiles launch so quickly that the window for preemptive strikes effectively closes before commanders can react. The result is that dozens or potentially hundreds of mobile launchers scattered across Iran's coastline remain viable threats. Destroying them all before they fire would require simultaneous strikes across hundreds of square kilometers. No military on Earth possesses the reconnaissance, coverage, strike capacity, or coordination to execute such an operation. The technical specifications of Iran's Khalij Fars missile family demonstrate why these systems pose existential threats to carriers. The Khalij Fars Persian Gulf missile is derived from the Fateh 110 short-range ballistic missile. It carries a 650-kilogram warhead and travels at speeds exceeding Mach 3 during terminal phase. The missile uses mid-course inertial guidance combined with electro-optical seeker for terminal homing on moving targets. Tests conducted by Iran since 2011 claim 100% success rates against ship-like targets in the Persian Gulf. While Western analysts debate those claims, the basic capability to hit large, slow-moving vessels appears genuine. The range of 300 kilometers means launchers positioned along Iran's coast can cover the entire Persian Gulf. USS Abraham Lincoln operating in the Arabian Sea remains outside this range, but also outside effective striking distance of many Iranian targets. USS Gerald R. Ford in the Mediterranean is even further removed, operating thousands of miles from the primary conflict zone. Neither carrier can conduct sustained operations against Iran without moving into the weapons engagement zone of Khalij Fars systems. The Hormuz missile variants add another dimension to the threat by targeting radar emissions from American warships. Hormuz 1 and Hormuz 2 are anti-radiation variants designed to home in on active radar systems. American destroyers equipped with Aegis radar must choose between maintaining situational awareness and presenting targets for these missiles. Turning off radars to avoid being targeted blinds the defensive systems that protect the carrier strike group. Keeping radars active provides the emission signature that guides Iranian missiles directly to high-value targets. This tactical dilemma has no good solution, forcing American commanders to accept risk, regardless of which option they choose. The geography of the Persian Gulf amplifies every advantage Iran possesses while negating many American strengths. At its narrowest point, the Strait of Hormuz measures only 21 nautical miles wide. The broader Persian Gulf ranges from 25 to 250 miles, separating Iranian and Arab shores. Aircraft carriers normally operate with defensive perimeters, extending hundreds of miles in all directions. In the Persian Gulf, those perimeters compress into dozens of miles, creating overlapping vulnerability zones. Iranian missiles positioned on Qeshm Island in the Strait can strike vessels anywhere in the southern Gulf. Launchers near Bandar Abbas threaten shipping lanes and naval forces operating in the central Gulf. Systems deployed along the northern coast provide coverage of approaches from the Arabian Sea. The cumulative effect is that no location in the Persian Gulf offers safety from saturation missile attacks. American carriers attempting to operate in these confined waters would face threats from multiple axes simultaneously. The mathematics of missile defense in the Persian Gulf create scenarios where American systems simply cannot win. Each Arleigh Burke-class destroyer carries approximately 96 vertical launch cells. These cells contain a mix of Tomahawk cruise missiles, SM-series air defense interceptors, and anti-submarine rockets. Interceptors designed for ballistic missile defense typically number 16 to 24 per destroyer. USS Gerald R. Ford's strike group includes 3 destroyers providing roughly 48 to 72 total ballistic missile interceptors. If Iran launches 200 ballistic missiles simultaneously, as it demonstrated capability to do, defenses would be overwhelmed. Even assuming 70% intercept rates, which would be optimistic under saturation attack conditions, 60 missiles would penetrate. A single missile carrying 650 kilograms of high explosive traveling at Mach 3 would mission kill a destroyer. 3 or 4 successful hits would likely sink the vessel outright. Against a carrier, even one penetrating hit could cause catastrophic damage requiring months of repairs. The Ford's electromagnetic aircraft launch system, advanced arresting gear, and weapons elevators all represent points of vulnerability. A missile strike damaging any of these systems would render the carrier unable to conduct flight operations. Without flight operations, a carrier becomes a $13 billion liability requiring protection rather than providing combat power. The speed of Iranian anti-ship ballistic missiles creates engagement timelines measured in minutes rather than hours. From launch to impact, Khalij Fars Missiles traverse 300 kilometers in approximately 3 to 4 minutes. Detection by satellite or radar-based systems requires several seconds for processing and threat assessment. Communication of threat data to ships requires additional seconds, depending on network configuration and encryption. Aegis combat systems must calculate intercept solutions and prepare SM-series missiles for launch. The total cycle from detection to intercept attempt realistically requires 60 to 90 seconds under ideal conditions. This leaves approximately 2 to 3 minutes for intercepts to occur before missiles enter terminal phase. Terminal phase begins when missiles descend to altitudes where radar horizon and sea clutter degrade tracking. Electro-optical seekers on college FARs activate during terminal phase, providing autonomous guidance independent of external targeting. At this point, jamming and electronic warfare become less effective as missiles home visually on large surface combatants. The compressed timeline means that mistakes, hesitation, or system failures prove catastrophic with no opportunity for recovery. Iranian strategy does not depend on sophisticated individual missiles, but on overwhelming numbers deployed rapidly. Intelligence assessments suggest Iran possesses between 3,000 and 5,000 ballistic missiles of various types. Not all are anti-ship variants, but hundreds of Khalij FARs and related systems are believed operational. Mobile launchers dispersed across Iran's coastline and interior regions can relocate after firing preventing effective counter-battery. Underground facilities near Bandar Abbas and other coastal cities provide protected storage for missile inventories. Iran demonstrated in February 2026 that it could launch over 100 ballistic missiles in a single day. Sustaining that launch rate for several days would exhaust American missile defense interceptor stocks across the entire theater. Aegis destroyers would expend their magazines, forcing withdrawal for rearming or leaving carriers without adequate protection. The logistics of resupplying interceptors at sea during combat operations presents challenges no Navy has solved. Ammunition ships carrying replacement missiles become high-value targets themselves, requiring protection from the carriers they resupply. The operational tempo required to defend against sustained Iranian missile campaigns cannot be maintained beyond several days. Historical precedent from Iran's own statements confirms that these missiles were designed specifically to deter American carrier operations. In 2013, Iran's deputy defense minister stated that U.S. naval fleets retreated after Khalij FARS tests. While the specifics of that claim are debated, the strategic intent was unmistakable. Iran developed anti-ship ballistic missiles to create zones where American carriers could not safely operate. The goal was not necessarily to sink carriers, but to force them far enough from Iranian shores to limit their effectiveness. Carriers operating 400 to 500 miles from targets can still launch strikes, but sortie rates decline. Aircraft must fly longer distances, consuming fuel and reducing time over target areas. Tanker aircraft become essential for every mission, creating additional coordination requirements and vulnerability. The cumulative effect reduces the strike capacity that made carrier aviation dominant in previous conflicts. Iran accepts that it cannot defeat American carriers in direct combat, but can make their deployment costly enough to deter operations. The current positioning of both U.S. carriers reflects exactly the standoff that Iranian planners intended to create. USS Abraham Lincoln in the Arabian Sea operates beyond Khalij FARs range, but hundreds of miles from optimal strike positions. USS Gerald R. Ford in the Mediterranean cannot reach most Iranian targets without extensive aerial refueling. Both carriers can generate sorties against Iran, but not with the overwhelming tempo that characterized operations against Iraq or Afghanistan. The dilution of American carrier power through geographic displacement represents strategic victory for Iran's anti-access approach. Advanced technology on USS Gerald R. Ford does not solve the fundamental problem of operating in missile-saturated environments. The electromagnetic aircraft launch system allows higher sortie rates than steam catapults on Nimitz-class carriers, but higher sortie rates mean nothing if the carrier cannot position itself within effective range of targets. The advanced weapons elevators move ordnance faster, reducing turnaround time between sorties. But faster ordnance handling provides no defense against ballistic missiles traveling at 3 times the speed of sound. The dual-band radar on Ford offers superior detection range against air threats. But detecting Iranian missiles earlier does not guarantee successful intercepts when defensive magazines contain limited interceptors. Every technological advantage Ford possesses relates to projecting power not surviving in contested littoral environments. The carrier was designed assuming American control of seas and ability to operate close to hostile shores. Those assumptions no longer hold against adversaries who invested decades developing weapons specifically to deny sea control. The cost-benefit analysis of risking carriers against Iranian missiles reveals why American commanders exercise extreme caution. USS Gerald R. Ford cost $13 billion to construct and represents years of industrial capacity. Losing the ship would constitute the worst American naval disaster since World War II. The psychological and political impact would dwarf the material loss. American military prestige rests partly on perception that its carriers can operate anywhere with impunity. A carrier sunk or severely damaged by Iranian missiles would shatter that perception permanently. Allies would question whether American security guarantees retained value if carriers proved vulnerable. Adversaries would conclude that anti-ship missiles provided asymmetric capabilities to challenge American naval power. The deterrent value of carriers depends on adversaries believing they can be deployed decisively. If carriers must remain hundreds of miles offshore to survive, their deterrent value declines proportionally. China, watching the Iran crisis closely, is drawing conclusions about carrier vulnerability in Taiwan scenarios. The Taiwan Strait, like the Persian Gulf, represents confined waters where anti-ship missiles could achieve saturation densities. If American carriers cannot effectively operate in the Persian Gulf, Chinese planners will assume similar vulnerability near Taiwan. The strategic implications extend far beyond Iran to fundamental questions about future naval warfare. Alternative approaches to the carrier dilemma exist, but none provide completely satisfactory solutions. Standoff strikes. Using submarine-launched cruise missiles avoid carrier vulnerability but reduce strike tempo. B-2 stealth bombers operating from distant bases can strike Iran, but cannot maintain continuous presence. B-52 bombers carrying cruise missiles face air defense risks if operating close enough for effective strikes. The combination of different platforms can replicate some carrier capabilities, but not with same flexibility and responsiveness. Carriers provide visible political commitment and ability to adjust operations rapidly as situations develop. Submarines and bombers operating from bases thousands of miles away cannot provide the same political signaling. The ideal solution would involve neutralizing Iranian missile capabilities before carriers enter engagement zones. But years of intelligence analysis have concluded that comprehensive destruction of Iranian missiles is impossible. Mobile launchers, hardened storage facilities, and Iran's strategic depth make total elimination unachievable. Even extensive air campaigns would only reduce missile inventories without eliminating the threat entirely. The diminishing returns of continued strikes against missiles would eventually make carrier deployment risks unacceptable. Naval warfare is evolving toward an environment where traditional capital ships face existential threats from shore-based systems. The age of battleship dominance ended when aircraft and submarines made surface ships vulnerable. The age of carrier dominance may be ending as anti-ship missiles make sea control untenable in contested littorals. Future naval power may reside more in submarines, unmanned systems, and distributed platforms rather than concentrated capital ships. The $9 billion question is whether American naval strategy will adapt to this reality or continue investing in vulnerable platforms. Current shipbuilding plans call for additional Ford-class carriers, despite mounting evidence of their vulnerability in modern warfare. Defense contractors and naval constituencies argue that carriers remain essential, despite risks. Critics counter that carrier procurement represents institutional inertia rather than strategic thinking about future conflicts. The Iran crisis is providing real-world test of theories that were previously academic debates. If carriers cannot operate effectively against Iranian missiles, how will they perform against more sophisticated Chinese systems? The DF-21 and DF-26 anti-ship ballistic missiles. China fields have far greater range than Khalij FARs. They also incorporate more advanced guidance systems, making successful defense even more problematic than against Iranian systems. A carrier that cannot safely approach Iranian shores certainly cannot operate within the first island chain against China. The strategic dead end this creates for American naval planning has no easy resolution. Billions already invested in carriers cannot be recouped, and ships have decades of service life remaining. But continuing to rely on vulnerable platforms in contested environments represents strategic malpractice. The compromise solution appears to be carriers operating at greater distances from threats while subordinate platforms assume risks. This reduces carrier effectiveness while preserving the ships themselves, creating suboptimal outcomes for all concerned. Wednesday, March 5th, finds both U.S. carriers operating hundreds of miles from where they would need to be for maximum effectiveness. USS Abraham Lincoln, conducting sorties from the Arabian Sea against Iranian targets, requires extensive aerial refueling. USS Gerald R. Ford in the Mediterranean can barely reach Iranian targets even with maximum range strike packages. Neither carrier can generate the sortie rates that would be possible if operating in the Persian Gulf itself, but operating in the Persian Gulf would expose both ships to saturation missile attacks they could not survive. The standoff represents not temporary tactical challenge, but permanent structural limitation on American naval power. Iran's Squirter missiles, fast-launching mobile anti-ship systems, have fundamentally changed the strategic calculus. The age when carriers could sail anywhere with impunity has ended. The future of naval warfare belongs to whoever adapts fastest to this new reality. And right now, Iran appears to understand that reality better than the United States Navy does. The tactical scenarios that keep carrier strike group commanders awake at night involve combinations of threats arriving simultaneously. Iranian doctrine does not envision anti-ship ballistic missiles operating in isolation, but as part of layered attacks. The opening salvo would likely include dozens of Khalij FARs missiles launched from dispersed mobile platforms. Simultaneously, cruise missiles launched from coastal batteries would approach from different azimuths at lower altitudes. Swarms of fast attack boats operated by Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy would close from multiple directions. Naval mines previously deployed in approaches to the Strait of Hormuz would threaten any vessel attempting transit. Diesel-electric submarines optimized for shallow water operations would position for torpedo attacks on damaged vessels. The cumulative effect creates decision paralysis for American commanders who cannot defend against all threats simultaneously. Aegis combat systems are sophisticated, but have finite processing capacity and limited missile inventories. Prioritizing ballistic missiles leaves cruise missiles and surface threats inadequately covered. Defending against cruise missiles and surface craft depletes interceptors needed for ballistic missile defense. No tactical arrangement of escorts provides adequate protection when facing hundreds of incoming threats from multiple vectors. The carriers themselves become liabilities requiring protection rather than platforms projecting power. The vulnerability of escort ships deserves particular attention since their loss would isolate carriers completely. Arleigh Burke-class destroyers represent $1.7 billion in construction costs each. USS Gerald R. Ford's strike group includes 3 destroyers representing over $5 billion in platforms protecting the carrier. If Iranian missiles sink or mission kill even one destroyer, the entire strike group becomes significantly more vulnerable. 2 destroyers cannot provide the same defensive coverage as 3, creating gaps in the protective envelope. Losing 2 destroyers would force immediate carrier withdrawal, as remaining escorts lack capacity to defend the high-value unit. The mathematics become even worse when considering that destroyers carry limited interceptor inventories. After defending against initial salvos, destroyers would need to withdraw for rearming at bases potentially hundreds of miles away. The time required to transit to ammunition depots, reload, and return to station creates windows of acute vulnerability. Carriers left with reduced escort during rearming periods face choices between withdrawing themselves or accepting catastrophic risk. Neither option allows sustained combat operations, which require continuous presence and ready availability of forces. The operational tempo needed to suppress Iranian threats would exhaust defensive capabilities within days, not weeks. Emerging Iranian missile technologies beyond Khalishfar's family compound the carrier vulnerability problem dramatically. The Fatah hypersonic missile, unveiled in June 2023, represents a generational leap in threat capability. This system travels at speeds between Mach 13 and Mach 15 during portions of its flight path. The maneuverable warhead can alter course both inside and outside atmosphere, making intercept probability approach zero. Current American missile defense systems, including SM-6 and THAAD, were not designed to intercept hypersonic maneuvering threats. Even theoretical upgrades to existing systems would struggle against targets moving at those velocities with unpredictable trajectories. If Fatah achieves operational status and demonstrates anti-ship capability, carrier vulnerability becomes absolute. No defensive system currently deployed or under development could reliably intercept waves of hypersonic anti-ship missiles. The only viable defense would be preventing launches through preemptive strikes. But hypersonic missiles, launched from mobile platforms deep inside Iran, exceed reach of carrier-based aircraft. The strategic dilemma becomes circular, with no military solution that does not require accepting unacceptable risks. Cost-benefit analysis of various missile defense enhancement options reveals why no easy fixes exist. Deploying additional Aegis destroyers to provide more interceptor magazines faces severe budget constraints. Each destroyer costs $1.7 billion and takes 3 to 4 years to construct. Building enough escorts to provide adequate magazine depth against Iranian saturation attacks would require dozens of additional ships. The shipbuilding capacity does not exist to construct that many destroyers in any reasonable time frame. The money required would approach $100 billion, exceeding the entire shipbuilding budget for years. Developing new interceptor technologies capable of defeating hypersonic threats requires decades of research and development. Programs like the Glide Phase Interceptor remain in early development with no deployment timeline before 2030. By the time new systems reach operational status, adversaries will have developed countermeasures rendering them obsolete. The technology race favors offense because missiles are simpler and cheaper than the systems required to defeat them. Procuring additional interceptor inventories for existing launchers provides marginal improvement at enormous cost. Standard missile, 6 interceptors cost approximately $4 million each. Equipping each destroyer in a carrier strike group with maximum interceptor load costs roughly $100 million per deployment. Those expenditures must be repeated for every deployment and every ship, creating recurring costs in billions annually. Meanwhile, Iran can produce anti-ship ballistic missiles at a fraction of interceptor costs, creating unfavorable cost-exchange ratios. The only economically sustainable approach involves not placing carriers in environments where they require such extensive protection. Political pressure to demonstrate resolve and support allies creates expectations that carriers will deploy regardless of risks. When USS Gerald R. Ford was ordered to the Mediterranean in February, the decision was driven by political considerations. Military commanders likely advised against deployment so close to Iranian missile ranges, but were overruled. The desire to show strength and support Israel took precedence over tactical military realities. This pattern repeats across decades, with carriers deployed to demonstrate commitment even when military utility is questionable. The result is platforms costing $13 billion sitting hundreds of miles from where they need to be for effectiveness. The political signaling value of carrier presence diminishes when those carriers cannot actually conduct sustained operations. Adversaries recognize that carriers maintaining safe distances represent paper tigers rather than genuine threats. The gap between perceived American power and actual ability to project force in contested environments is growing. That gap creates dangers of miscalculation, as adversaries conclude they can challenge American interests without serious consequences. The broader implications for American global strategy extend far beyond Iran to fundamental questions about force structure. The United States operates 11 aircraft carriers, a centerpiece of its global military posture. Annual operating costs for the carrier fleet exceed $15 billion, not including construction or aircraft procurement. If carriers cannot operate effectively in contested littorals, their utility is limited to permissive environments. But permissive environments, by definition, do not require overwhelming force that carriers provide. The strategic logic supporting carrier-centric Navy dissolves when primary missions become unachievable due to vulnerability. Alternative force structures emphasizing submarines' unmanned systems and distributed platforms offer better survivability. Attack submarines costing $3 billion can operate in areas where carriers cannot venture. Virginia-class submarines carry Tomahawk cruise missiles, enabling strikes without exposing high-value surface units. The Navy's current plan calls for maintaining current submarine force levels while building additional carriers. Budget constraints mean every dollar spent on carriers reduces funding available for submarines and other priorities. The opportunity costs of carrier procurement in terms of capabilities, not purchased, receive insufficient attention. Arguments for maintaining carriers often cite their versatility and ability to respond to unpredictable crises. But versatility becomes irrelevant if platforms cannot survive in most likely conflict scenarios. The debate over future force structure must grapple with uncomfortable realities that institutional interests prefer to avoid. Carrier battle groups employ tens of thousands of sailors and support extensive industrial base. Shifting away from carriers threatens jobs, congressional districts, and relationships with defense contractors. The political economy of defense procurement often trumps military necessity when capability decisions are made. Until a carrier is actually sunk or severely damaged by anti-ship missiles, these institutional pressures will likely prevail. The Iran crisis provides preview of what Chinese anti-access systems could achieve in even more confined waters. The Taiwan Strait represents worst-case scenario for carrier operations with extreme geographic constraints. Chinese DF-21D anti-ship ballistic missiles outrange Khalij FARs by a factor of 3 or more. The DF-26 extends ranges further, still able to target carriers throughout the Western Pacific. China's inventory of anti-ship systems dwarfs Iran's both in quantity and technological sophistication. The electromagnetic spectrum environment near Taiwan would be far more contested than anything Iran could generate. Chinese cyber capabilities would threaten carrier battle management networks in ways Iran cannot replicate. If carriers cannot effectively operate in Persian Gulf, they certainly cannot operate in Taiwan scenarios. The strategic implications for American ability to defend Taiwan are profound and deeply troubling. Commitments to Taiwan's defense rest partly on assumptions about carrier availability during crises. If carriers must remain hundreds of miles offshore, their ability to influence Taiwan conflict outcomes becomes questionable. Japan's willingness to host American bases depends partly on confidence that those forces can achieve meaningful military objectives. Revelations about carrier vulnerability in contested environments could accelerate Japanese reconsideration of alliance commitments. The cascade effects through American alliance structures in Indo-Pacific could prove catastrophic for regional security architecture. Wednesday, March 5, 2026, may be remembered as inflection point when carrier limitations became undeniable. The distance USS Gerald R. Ford maintains from Iranian shores is not temporary tactical adjustment. It represents permanent acknowledgement that $13 billion platforms cannot safely approach defended coastlines. The creative solutions that naval planners propose cannot overcome fundamental physics of missile speeds and defensive limitations. Carriers traveling at 30 knots cannot outrun missiles traveling at Mach 3. Defensive systems requiring minutes to engage cannot defeat threats arriving in seconds. Magazine depths measured in dozens cannot overcome saturation attacks measured in hundreds. No amount of training technological advancement or tactical innovation changes these basic realities. The question facing American strategists is whether to acknowledge these limitations and adapt or continue pretending they do not exist. Current evidence suggests institutional preference for pretense over acknowledgement. USS Gerald R. Ford will eventually return to Norfolk and be heralded as successful deployment. Press releases will tout sorties flown and readiness demonstrated without mentioning the restrictions under which it operated. Congress will continue funding additional Ford-class carriers based on assumptions no longer consistent with reality. And the next crisis will find another carrier group maintaining prudent distance from another adversary's missiles. The cycle will continue until the unthinkable happens and a carrier is actually sunk. Only then will the institutional resistance to fundamental change in naval strategy potentially weaken. But waiting for catastrophe before adapting represents strategic malpractice of the highest order. Though warnings are present in the distances carriers maintain from Iranian shores, the lessons are available in the technical specifications of Iranian anti-ship missiles. The implications are clear in the mathematics of defensive limitations against saturation attacks. What remains unclear is whether American naval strategy will evolve to address these realities, or whether institutional inertia will prevail until disaster forces change. The carriers retreating from Iran's Squirter missiles are not just avoiding tactical threats. They are revealing the future of naval warfare and America's adaptation challenges in that future. The Navy that dominated seas for 70 years must transform or become irrelevant. And transformation requires admitting that the platforms and concepts that brought past success guarantee future failure. Iran's anti-ship ballistic missiles launched rapidly from mobile platforms demonstrate one possible future of naval combat. That future belongs not to massive capital ships vulnerable to shore-based fires, but to distributed systems that survive through dispersion. The sooner American naval strategy accepts this reality, the better prepared it will be for conflicts ahead. But acceptance requires abandoning cherished assumptions and admitting that billions already spent may not produce useful capabilities. That level of institutional honesty remains rare in defense planning circles. Until it becomes common, U.S. carriers will continue maintaining safe distances while pretending nothing has fundamentally changed. And adversaries will continue developing the anti-ship missiles that enforce those safe distances. The retreat of carriers is not temporary tactical adjustment, but strategic transformation occurring in real time. The only question is whether American naval leadership will acknowledge the transformation or continue denying what is increasingly obvious. Iran's Squirter missiles have provided the answer in the kilometers that separate carriers from coastlines, and that distance is only going to increase as missile technologies advance and more nations field similar capabilities. The age of carrier dominance is ending not with dramatic battles, but with prudent withdrawals to safer distances. And those prudent withdrawals are wise recognition that naval warfare has fundamentally changed. The challenge now is building a navy suited to that changed reality, rather than one designed for wars already won.